If Claire had bothered to look back, she would have been surprised to see the looks on the hotel guests' faces. Strangers to her, but more or less united in their grief of seeing distress in someone so young. A few had gone back to their business, continuing as if it was an everyday occurrence, while some strangers had wondered what could have upset this girl with the startling, beautiful green jade eyes. Others were now looking for someone to blame, and their red mist had descended on the tall, greying form of the child's pursuers. He had dashed at a fair pace towards the main double doors from the lobby lift, but Mr. Hadley was too late. He had stood at the main entrance, huffing and blowing, holding his stomach. He had stopped outside the door, scanning the landscape with his hands over his eyes. Despite being past 9 o'clock, and it now being as dark as midnight outside, if Claire had looked back, she would have really been surprised at what she would have seen. In the welcoming ethereal lights shining from the doors and the windows of the building she had been so keen to vacate, Richard Hadley now had his hands cupped over his mouth, shouting her name into the cold, dark night. Claire could not hear him, and she could not see him. Mr. Hadley had sighed deeply. He had closed his eyes for a brief second before promptly opening them again, turning on his heel back into the hotel, his head shaking. It was dark and scary for an 11-year-old girl to be all alone and upset. 9 o'clock shadows flaunted their sinister powers for playing with the human senses. Claire, on the chewing-gum patchworked bench, breathed a shiver away and glanced around her for the first time. She noted in the dim light of the moon her surroundings, her eyes quite clear of tears now. She could make out a tarmac path, which the bench was resting on, as it arched around the edges of the central grassy verge like a solid, non-flowing ocean. There were a few trees spread around the area, one to her left. It was a silver birch, she noted, and there were two to her right, but she didn't know what they were. There was a thorny crown of dark, unidentifiable bushes, which intertwined with Victorian-style black fences, which surrounded and enclosed Claire's new-found world. It was a dark and largely uneventful place, just what Claire wanted and needed. There was no one to bother her. She resumed her stargazing and pondered the night's events. "Oh, the stars are so beautiful," she murmured to herself as she scanned them all. She often did this. To her there was nothing so calming. It made her problems seem so small when compared to the stars in the sky. She sighed to herself and thought of the trouble she had caused, and what trouble she would be in when she returned to her grandparents. "I could sit here and wait," she thought, sitting up. "Yes, I could sit here and wait for an alien to come and get me," she shouted, smiling at the thought. There was still no one around to hear her imagination burning from her heart, from her mind. That would show them. I'd never come back then. Claire positively beamed at the idea. She could imagine her grandparents being over the moon. I'd go to his planet, meet his family and stay forever. She giggled to herself as she rested back down upon her uncomfortable bench. Suddenly there was a crack of breaking wood. Claire sprung to attention like an uncoiling spring, almost losing her heart to her throat. She'd managed to control herself enough to stop any kind of noise escaping her mouth, but she could not control the panic within her. She sat, bolt upright. Her legs shot back to her body, so that she tightened them against her chest and hugged them closely, trying to make herself as small as she could. As time froze, her insides began to spiral out of control. Her imagination flared up once more. She considered jumping from the bench and running as fast as she could, but there was nothing to run from. She sat there, trying to focus in the cool, still air. She could still hear the light swish of distant cars on some road far away. However, there was something else. Something she could only describe as a scrape, scrape, scrape. She concentrated hard, trying to ignore her pulsating jackhammer of a heart in her chest. Thump. She dared not breathe. Her heart was pounding, faster and faster. Thump. She placed her feet on the cold tarmac. Thump, thump. She rose to stand up, moving forward and swallowing hard, trying to probe for a better look. Suddenly the scraping stopped. Thump, thump, thump. There was something moving. Claire blinked, but dared not move another muscle. Had she imagined the movement? She jumped a little, clapping her hands to her face as something shiny, something sleek, almost sly in its movements, dancing in the darkness. She could not make it out, as it confused her eyes. Whatever it was about the size of a large tabby cat, and she was sure it was blending in with the darkness surrounding it, as if it was a true creature of the night, something that flowed in and out of shadow. Claire shielded her eyes as a sudden source of light shone towards her. 2 miniature spectrum circles, reflecting the moon's glamour. They shone beacon-like directly towards her, from within the shadow of a nearby tree. It hurt her eyes as she tried to stare back, feeling more and more like a rabbit caught in headlights. She tried to shield her eyes again, but she couldn't move, even if she wanted to. The creature's stare had paralyzed her. "Be careful what you wish for, child." A cool, deep, slightly gnarled voice spoke. Claire squinted towards the source of the voice that rumbled through her. She questioned herself. Maybe she was still on the bench, sleeping soundly, imagining all of this in her dreams. "No, this is not a dream," it growled smoothly. The bright, shining eyes whispered as they lost their vividness. "Come with me." With that, the speaker stalked slowly forward, as if answering Claire's thoughts, moving from the dark confines of the shadows into the moon's otherworldly glow. There was a state of mystification in the air. Claire, still standing perfectly still, looked into the dark, looked at this shadowy creature with bemusement. There in front of her was the most curious thing her young eyes had ever seen. A sly, sleek blue fox stared back at her. Its colour was a deep royal blue, with a lighter underbelly that ran down its 4 legs. Now that Claire was close enough, she could study the creature's eyes. The creature stared back, fixing her, expressionless. The eyes appeared fiery red with shots of orange, like looking at embers of a dying fireplace. The fox pawed the soft grass under its foot. The scrape, scrape returned as he did so. It shook its head in what looked like annoyance. He was gently cutting away at the dirt, like a tiny blue bull getting ready to charge. Claire stood awestruck. This creature looked like a fox, from its sleek fur, its keen eyes, to its brush-like tail, but it was blue. Claire breathed heavily and steadied her heart and mind so that she could speak. "Excuse me, Mr. Fox, but what are you?" Claire asked, for once in her life stuck for words to a situation. The fox simply stared. He didn't attempt to reply. It simply stopped the pawing, fixed the child, allowing its apparent intelligence to show through from behind its bloodstone eyes. The mysterious fox peered at Claire, silent and still for a second before turning away and moving into the shadows like liquid. "Where?" Claire spoke before her voice gave out. It was all she could manage. Her voice had abandoned her. She could no longer speak. She could no longer breathe. There was no air in her body, and her head was starting to spin. She felt lightheaded, almost sick to the pit of her stomach, as chaotic thoughts filled her mind of fear and death. She gasped, grasping her neck, but the words choked in her throat. She felt the weightlessness pass through her body, along with her panic. It filled her feet, her hands, her legs, her arms and her toes. Everything became lighter than air until she felt a strange sensation. It welled up in her navel, pulling her up from the inside, lifting her feet from the ground. She wanted to scream. She wanted to touch the ground, but she couldn't. She tore her eyes away from the pavement as panic gripped her more and more. She was almost to the top of the silver birch. Claire tried to struggle with every fibre of her being. She kicked and punched, twisting and mouthing silently, trying to escape from some invisible encasing bubble. But nothing she did seemed to matter. She could do nothing. The lack of breath was forcing her eyes closed. She scanned for the fox. Where was the fox? It was nowhere. She could feel her body shutting down, blacking out, her eyes now useless behind their heavy closing lids. She could smell a charge in the air, like the coming of a storm, with a swish and a crack that shot to her ears. Feeling nothing more than a dream, Claire Marshall was conscious no more.